Welcome back to the channel after the little break that we had to take to produce this series. Today begins our new backhand series, and it will cover both the one-handed and the two-handed backhand. However, there will be quite a more emphasis on the one hand in terms of technical content than the two-hand, although both will benefit because 95% of the people who play recreational tennis and those who watch this channel are one-handers, so there will be that focus on the one hand. The title of today's lesson is the Kinetic Whip Backhand and a New Technique. So as most of you know, I spent most of my career as a recreational tennis player until I decided that good enough wasn't good enough. And I embarked on a course of research and practical deliberate practice to see how good I could get. So I went about studying all the GOAT strokes in tennis, but expanded the idea of swinging to all swinging and throwing sports. So now I subscribe to over 60 YouTube channels involved with throwing and swinging. The idea here is I wanted to find out how the GOATs swing in all these different sports and how they throw in all these different sports, and see if I could learn more about swinging through that process. And so that's why I say that most of what I've learned, I learned from reading or watching YouTube. The other thing I changed 6 years ago was moving away from the casual stand on the baseline type of practice that most recreational players do, which you're basically just reinforcing your current style and habits, to something that has basis in science, which is this general theory of deliberate practice. This is based on 40 years of academic research across all domains of how one becomes an expert in a skill. And that's why I've been promoting the books, and I hope you get a chance to read some of them. But I changed my practice to a much more focused, deliberate manner that I've been describing, and that's also made a huge difference. So that's the context and background for this new series of instructional pieces on the backhand. But unlike most series of articles or courses that have a long background and context, and you ramp up over time to the final grand conclusions, in some ways I'm starting with the grand conclusion here first, the most important thing that I've learned here first. And that's why the title "and a new technique" is in the title of this particular video. So this new technique that I developed came out of 6 years of deliberate practice, where I practiced for weeks of each of the backhand models, the one-handers. I'm a one-hander. So Wawrinka, Gasquet, Federer, Haas, and even going back in time to Guga Kuerten and Justine Henin, who also I think belongs in the GOAT discussion for one-handed technique. So I developed a pretty good version of all those models, I think, and over time I'll show them to you. But there was always a level of frustration that I wasn't getting as much as I thought I could get. And what this new technique that I'm going to talk about today, I call the hammer whip backhand, comes out of this long trial that I've had to see if I could make this breakthrough on the backhand side. And I want to share that with you right away today. And I think it'll open up some new vistas for you. So there's a ton to get to, so let's get started right away. Before we talk about my new technique, we need to cover some background and context on the backhand in general. So from a big picture, 50,000 foot level, as I've been saying, the forehand and backhand look and function in a very similar way. At the highest levels in the modern era, the backhand is a whip swing driven by the rotating body, the kinetic chain of rotation that is built into our system and has evolved over, many long eons. And as I've said before, the same principles and feels of a high-level modern swing on the forehand side will apply almost equally on the backhand side. So both strokes will have to be performed from an athletic posture, not the standing vertical and stiff body posture that we see in recreational tennis, but a athletic form, where there's a tilt of the body and there's weight into the lower body and a ready for movement kind of feel. Both forehand and backhand have an underlying functionality of throwing, and both in the windup and in the release, there is a throwing action that is a free release of the racket that we get when we throw a ball or throw a frisbee or throw a discus. The other thing that's in common, of course, is the whip principle, that we're building up this coiling and wind up in our body so that we get to a point where we can produce a whip-like effect with the racket. And this is going to be 3 or 4 times faster than the old linear levering, pushing action that we see in most recreational players. Of course, we have the foundation of the kinetic chain as driving all this process, which is 32 body segments, all going in rotation in sequence and building speed and power as they go up the body. This is a foundational principle of both the forehand and the backhand. In addition, as opposed to what most recreational players think about both the forehand and the backhand swing, they tend to think of it as a horizontal circular action, something like this, forehand side like this. And yes, for the topspin, maybe they have an idea that there's this sort of ascending arm motion. But in that conception of this sort of round circular action, they think of the release coming in this horizontal swinging gate action on the backhand side and the forehand side, when in fact we're going to see that just as on the forehand side, the racket from the slot is coming up on edge, and that it comes up on edge from the start and goes through a whole windshield wiper action from beginning to end. And that same dynamic is in play on the backhand. We come out of the slot on edge and we're throwing out on edge. And we'll have the same way that we connect with the racket on our backhand side as on our forehand side. So we're going to talk about this in great detail, of course, as we want the grip to be in the fingers and we want it to be oriented towards more of a closed face angle on the forehand and the backhand side. So we're not looking for a slightly ascending horizontal circular path. We're looking for a sharply vertical spiraling path where the bracket's going 25 to 30% vertical through the impact zone. We're going to talk about how on both sides the main driving force is going to be the core of the body's muscles, the biggest muscles in our body. Not an arm-driven swing, but a body-driven swing featuring a pulling action on the arm and the racket as it releases at the end. We're going to talk quite a bit today about the width and depth in the swing. We talked about how on the forehand side we had to take the racket back high here and drop it behind us. Well, on the forehand, our hitting dominant arm is to the rear of us. on the trail side. Now we have the opposite case in the backhand, where our dominant arm and lead arm is to the front. And so this will provide specific challenges to getting this racket back and deep enough that we're going to talk about. And then we'll also be talking about some new principles, not just rehashing things that we've gone over, although in saying rehashing, we can always refresh and deepen our understanding of all these principles. But we will be talking about new principles, and they'll apply to your forehand and backhand, so you get a little bit of a forehand bonus in this backhand series. So here we see Roger Federer's backhand, maybe not considered the best of all time, but, among the best single backhanders, of course. And we'll discuss in detail why he may not be the best. And I don't think he is the best. But when we talk about one-handed versus two-handed backhand, we need to understand something extremely important right from the beginning, is that 2/3 of the one-handed backswing is done with two hands. So we're starting off initially, of course, grasping in a ready position with our two hands, but then in the one-handed, the non-dominant hand slides up to the throat of the racket in one form or another, and then this is taken back with two hands. So that's phase one of the backhand, right? And then going this way now, the opponent's this way, but once we get it back here, then we also have to drop the racket and drop the racket head, so that as we come up, racket head is going to be underneath the ball and we can create topspin. And the second phase, the drop into the slot, is also accomplished with two hands. It's only as we come out of the slot does the non-hitting hand drop off in the one-handed backhand, and we have a one-handed release. But this whole process takes typically about a second. So 3/4 or 2/3 of a second is taken up with two hands on the racket for the one-hander. And only in the last third of a second is the one-handed release accomplished. Before I go on, I should say that, of course, this description of the one-handed backhand is more for players that have already started the process of a higher level one-handed backhand by using two hands. And not that many players do it. Typically, the recreational player, once again, just like on the forehand side, their hands immediately split and the racket just goes to the side. On the backhand, it's really even worse, which they drop their hands, split, and now they're still facing the target mostly, either like this or like this, and then they can barely take the racket back at all. And then there's this kind of horizontal swiping motion going on, or a slicing motion. So when we talk about one-handed technique versus two-handed technique, we really have to clarify why the overwhelming number of best players in the world use a two-handed backhand. And it's becoming more and more dominant. Among the top 100 male players now, only 10 use a single-handed backhand technique. And among the women, two-handed is even more dominant. There's only one woman in the top 100 that uses a single backhanded technique. So there are various reasons for this, and we're not going to go into all of them today. There's certain advantages about hitting out of an open stance with a two-handed. There's advantages to steadying the racket path through contact, perhaps, that we'll get into. But there's the reasons that I want to focus today are a little bit different. I think the principal reason that the two-hand has become so dominant as a technique is the difficulty in the single-handed backhand, the same difficulties I experienced. So you can see in the slides here, the Federer and Tommy Haas, two of the best single-handed backhanders of all time, when they take the racket back with their non-hitting hand on the throat of the racket, that as they take back, there is a space and width restriction with this way they've grasped the racket and taken it back. You can see it looks intrinsically, tight and cramped here. And yes, there are techniques to expanding this out, and we'll get into those. But there's just a basic spacing and width and space issue and control of this racket head issue. Yes, the non-hitting hand on the throat gives you a lot more control that way, but there are issues with that we want to go into. However, every time you watch television, which I just was watching the match this week with Team and Wawrinka, the commentators always talk about what a beautiful one-handed backhand they have. And, it's just truly, probably the most beautiful thing in tennis is this one-handed backhand. And yet, we're seeing the demise of this one-handed backhand. Among the top 100 male players, only 10 use a single-handed technique. And 4 of those, Dimitrov, Gasquet, Team, and Wawrinka, they're close to retirement or are going to retire soon. So it seems to be heading for oblivion. One of the questions I want to address in this article is, is that inevitable, or is the one-hander inevitably going to oblivion? And I think you'll see that it's not necessarily that way. But before we get too deep in tennis, I want to tell you this quick story about Alex Honnold and the boulder problem. Now, who is Alex Honnold? He's the first and only man to scale the dawn wall of El Capitan in Yosemite, 3,200 feet of this vertical granite wall without the aid of ropes. So Alex Honnold made his ascent in 3.5 hours on one day on June 3rd, 2017. But he spent a whole year preparing himself for this climb. This was a whole year of intense, deliberate practice. And this is often the case of athletic achievement, is you see the record, or you see the spectacular event, but you don't see all the work behind it. And it's always long weeks, months, years even of deliberate practice. I said about our goal of building a much better forehand or backhand, you need a map. You need to know where you're going, and you need to do some planning about where you're going to move. Well, Alex Honnold had to do the same thing. He had to break this 3,200 foot climb into different sections that each had its own different challenges, and he had to practice the technique to overcome those challenges on each of those sections. But the section that he spent the longest on and was the most difficult was what he called the boulder problem. This was a 10-foot section of El Capitan, the most sheer face, part of the smoothest face. And there is one where the footholds and the handholds are extremely tiny, just a finger grasp or thumb grasp to hold onto the face of the rock. And at one point in this 10-foot section, there's a point where, in order to keep ascending, he has to basically jump from one section of the wall to another, totally let go without ropes, and then catch himself with these tiny handholds and footholds on the other section of this wall. And of course, he's climbing without ropes. If he failed, he was dead. And so he spent many of those years practice with ropes in safety, practicing the boulder problem, how to solve it. And at first, when he thought of doing it, he thought it was totally impossible. He would be committing suicide by trying it. But over time, as he tried it, and he would inevitably fall, but of course the ropes caught him, he would learn a little bit more and a little bit more, and he'd develop his technique a little bit more until he felt confident enough that, yes, he could do it without the ropes. And that's when he made his famous ascent, which was captured in the movie Free Solo. And I'll put a little clip in the notes where you can see just in a minute how Honnold handled practicing the boulder problem. It's very inspirational. So in terms of developing a better one-handed or two-handed backhand, I would say the boulder problem is this issue of the width and the space that we have on the backhand side when we're in the take back and drop into the slot. This is the most difficult thing to overcome, and I certainly faced that challenge as well. And it was only partially successful until I developed this new better technique, which I'll explain. So we need sufficient spacing for our arms to be able to drop this racket back here with sufficient length and depth so that we can build the momentum for the swing, and then also drop the racket head as it comes out of the slot so that we can have this sharply ascending release. In sum, the boulder problem is that the take back and drop is too cramped for comfort and for ease. It's extremely difficult to learn to overcome this. That is the boulder problem. Now, as you can see in the slides in the background, for the two-handed backhand player, this problem is much, much easier, because with two hands at the end part of the racket, they can extend this racket back so much further and have so much freedom and more control over the racket with two hands, and in order to swing and drop this into the slot. And I think there's other reasons, of course, but this is one of the main reasons that the two-handed technique has become so dominant in the modern era. The two-handed coordinates the swinging arms with the rotating body better and helps us load and unload the body-driven motion typically better than the single-handed take back and release, which will tend to start to disconnect the hitting arm with the rotating body, and we get the arm action going off on its own. But what people don't often talk about is that though the pros are adopting the two-handed technique, they are giving up some things in that two-handed technique. They're giving up the ability to reach a ball from the two-handed side. That's one of the reasons why there's no two-handed forehands out there anymore, is that we have a much longer reach with the single-handed than the two hands. So if we had two hands on the forehand, you can see how much more restricted my swing arc can be than one hand. Same thing applies on backhand side. And the other thing that is we give up is some amount of speed with the free release of the arm in the swinging motion. On the forehand side, typically with one hand, players get 15% more speed than they can with their two-handed backhand side. On average, something like that. So the two-handed backhand is slower and has a more restricted reach. We'll get into this in more detail. You can see in the slide in the background, I say that this free release and unrestricted arc of the arm with one hand is the reason why we throw a frisbee with one arm only. We never throw it like this. The same thing will apply to a discus that we'll see in a moment. So we talked earlier about the commentators bemoaning the loss of the beautiful one-handed backhand in tennis. So this throwing motion that we're talking about is beautiful for a reason, and you can see in this ancient statue of Discobulus, who's the discus thrower. And this is a statue that was made around 450 BC of an Olympic Greek athlete, in the discus throwing motion. And it represents, the ideal of the athletic form in which we're seeing the spiraling, rotating energy that we've been talking about all along. But we also see the harmony and the balance and the power that comes from this unfurling and flinging action, either with a frisbee or with a discus. So there is a reason that we throw the discus and the frisbee with one arm. And this has a lot to do with the radius of the arc of the swing that we can produce with one arm versus two. And to illustrate this, I'm gonna use golf as an example here. And so we have in my hands here a 6-iron, and we have a driver. And from this perspective, you can see how much shorter the 6-iron is. It's 8 inches shorter than the driver. This is what it looks like from the ground in sort of a hitting position. So here we can see the orientation, more like a hitting orientation here with the 6-iron and the driver extended in front of me. So this driver is only 8 inches longer than this iron, and while the iron's slightly heavier, it's not that much heavier. But with a longer radius of the driver versus the 6-iron, pros swing this driver 23% faster. Average of 121 miles an hour on the tour with the club head, and only 93 with the 6-iron. And there are a few other reasons, but the principal reason is the longer radius of this swing arc around our body. The swing radius on swing speed applies in tennis as well. So with a single-handed backhand, we have a much longer arc radius, and they have the capability of producing more speed if we do it right than we can with a shorter two-handed arc. So is there a way to keep this beautiful one-handed stroke in the game of tennis? Let me propose a way. So is there a way of overcoming this cramped position in the take back and drop in the slot for the one-hander? What I discovered this new technique after a long frustration is, what if we, instead of doing it like everyone's always done it with the non-hitting hand, grasping the throat or the racket in the take back and having this cramped position back here, what if we just grip the racket like the normal two-hander would down here at the end of the handle, but then we, from there, acted like it was a single-handed backhand. So now you can see how much further my arms are extending away from the body, just like Novak or Nadal would do. But I'm thinking one-handed, not two hands in my release. But now I have control of this racket head in the handle here with both hands, and I have more maneuverability, I think, and flexibility and space and width and depth and all the things that we need to just wind up and drop this into the slot in a much more fluid, powerful way than I had when I was getting all cramped up in here. That's the essence of the new technique. So what I found in trying this new technique on all the existing one-handed models is that it improved them all, as there was much more width, space, and lack of restriction to do any particular one-handed model. So basically, this would be a way of getting the width and space that a two-hander has, but also getting the unrestricted arc and the speed that comes from a one-handed release. So I'm calling this the hammer whip backhand technique, because just like in a hammer throw, the hammer thrower grasps the handle that is attached to a line and a ball at the end with two hands, and his arms are extended away from the body, and then he circles this, and then eventually he flings it out. Yes, using two hands, but the basic rotational action, the pulling of the arms away from the body in a wide circle, is a hammer throw. So hence my name, the hammer throw backhand. So now this is like a Dominic team, if you can remember, team's backhand. We'll be getting into it. You know, he has a high straight arm out here, and when he had his existing technique with a non-hitting hand on the throat, this extension was always a little bit difficult, and it always looked stiff and awkward because this arm had to be so bent with holding the throat of the racket. But if you move that hand down to the end, now you can extend your arms out here like this without any feeling of discomfort. In fact, once you get used to it, it's very comfortable. And then you can have a bigger wind up, and then you can keep the hand on a little bit longer even, which we'll talk about, but most typically you don't really need it, and you can release it as you come out of this. A few more explanatory words around the word hammer technique and why I chose that. Because on the surface, somebody might say, well, Kim, you're saying that we have a wider swing arc and possibly greater speed with a greater swing radius with one arm. But in the hammer throw, they swing this ball around their body 4 or 5 times and release it with 2 hands. So it's a two-handed release, which is true. So why do they do that? Well, because at the end of this grip and line, there's a 16-pound ball that the hammer thrower is throwing. The same ball essentially that the shot putter shot puts. So in rotating this 4 or 5 times around the body before releasing it, the 16-pound ball is building up tremendous centrifugal outward pulling force on the body, arms, and hands. And so yes, the hammer thrower has to hang on with both arms and hands to twirl it and throw it. But the reason that we don't have that same issue in tennis or in frisbee throwing or discus is this frisbee only weighs a couple ounces. So it'd make no sense to try to throw it with 2 arms, right? And a discus only weighs slightly over 2 pounds. So again, we're gonna use the wider arc and faster swing speed of a single arm release. And in the same way, even though we're gonna, in this new technique, grip the racket down here at the end of the handle, somewhat like and take it back somewhat like a wide arc like a hammer thrower might, and wind it up and release it. This only weighs 10 or 11 ounces. So there's really no necessity to hold on to it for 2 hands in order to control it. We can release it with 1 arm and get all the whipping power and speed that we want. I'm not saying that 2 hands doesn't have its place, obviously does. It is the preferred technique for a variety of reasons that we'll get into more and we've already discussed. But so that's the reason that I'm calling it the hammer whip, is that, yeah, we sort of 2/3 of the stroke we're controlling with 2 hands and 2 arms, but there's that whip component that if we choose to, we can release and do with 1 arm. So that's the hammer whip explanation. Slot. So now the 3 phases that we have to go through in every stroke is, you know, we have the take back, and like I said, with Novak, it's take back, he has the racket extending out here like this nice wide arc, and he has the racket tipped out, and then he gradually brings it up on edge back here, and he extends way back here with a straight arm. Well, now we could do the same thing with the one-handed backhand using the team model up here, and we can drop into the slot with 2 hands, just like they do. But then as we come out of the slot, we can, if we choose to, we can release this hand and get a wider arc and a faster swing speed with the single-handed. Said that this new technique, hammer whip technique, helped me improve all the different one-handed models that I worked on, and I certainly worked on Gasquet's model for weeks on end. And So without further ado, I'll show you Gasquet executing his stroke, and then my version of the Gasquet backhand using the hammer whip model. You can take a look at it for yourself. So what are the advantages and potential advantages of this new one-handed technique? Of course, it immediately addresses the boulder problem in the backhand, which is that you're going to have more width and depth in the take back and the drop into the slot. I think it'll give you greater racket head control because you're not going to be in this cramped position, and then as you get dropping into the slot, it's even more difficult. Now you have a lot more freedom and space to operate, controlling the racket at the end of the handle. I think it has the potential to produce greater topspin and racket head speed with the free release on the single hand with a wider arc. Certainly, I think the two-handed take back of the hammer will give you better take back control and consistency as you move through this whole process. And then overall greater racket head speed because you're going to be able to load your body more effectively and have a longer arm and swing path in this whole process with this new technique. Now, before you get too worried that we're going to be on this alarming, radical new course the whole time, we're not. Now, I want to spend a couple of lessons talking about and having you try out this new technique, but we will be covering all the traditional two-handed and one-handed techniques, and I'll teach you everything that I learned and all the dead ends that I reached and try to overcome those more quickly for you. But I do want you to explore this because I think it will open up some new understandings of the backhand in general. And so, you know, is this whole idea that I'm introducing here of a two-handed take back and one-handed release, is that just simply crazy? Well, it's really not. You know, and some of the greatest ball strikers of all time in sports basically use this technique, including the one you see on the slide behind me, which is Ken Griffey Jr., who many analysts think had the most beautiful baseball swing of all time. And it was also incredibly effective and powerful. He hit 630 home runs in his career. And, you know, Babe Ruth hit 712, but you can see how much power and speed he could generate with his technique. And basically it was a two-handed coil and take back, and he kept the hand on sometimes through the whole swing, and other times, especially far out in the plate, he would release the hand as you see in the picture behind me. And again, we see a whole spectrum of people that release early or only partially or relax their hand. There's a whole range, but some of the greatest hitters of all time that I've listed here had a release of this trail hand fully or partially in their swinging process. And it's just not applies to baseball alone. In golf, we've had the same history of players that have had their trail hand partially or fully releasing on the club, including probably the most famous is VJ Singh, former #1 professional golfer in the world. Won 3 Grand Slams, 59 titles, and one of the longest hitters on the tour. And, you know, he frequently would release and relax his hand to take it off at the end, towards the end, in the process of the release. And I'll have a short video clip in the notes section where you can see both Ken Griffey Jr. taking his hand off the racket and swinging, and VJ Singh. So I encourage you to take a look at those. But again, in addition, some of the greatest golfers of all time have also had a partial trail hand release in their golf swing. So we know we can still maintain the face control and closing of the racket that we need in this swinging process in tennis as well, with just using one or partially one hand. And that concludes the movement map portion of this instructional video. For those of you who are new, we usually have 2 different sections. We have the overview of here's the general ideas and descriptions. That's called the movement map. You have to have an idea of where you're going and where you're going to be moving. And then we have a follow-on how-to section, a deliberate practice section that we'll now go to, where I try to lead you through a series of deliberate practices where you can start to feel these new techniques and these new principles and then build it into your swing over time. We're now in the how-to deliberate section of our lesson. And as usual, I have to caution you about injury prevention and taking it seriously as we do more and more deliberate practice. It is a much more serious way of training and can be more strenuous, typically is more strenuous after a while. So you want to be sure not to even try this if you're injured or sore in any way. And I'll post this checklist in the background as I usually do. And stop the exercise immediately if you feel any soreness or pain. Do all the exercises correctly in an athletic posture so you don't injure or twist and over-rotate something that shouldn't be twisted or over-rotated. And start the exercise slowly and work your way up. Don't just plunge into it and go all out. The title of today's lesson is the Kinetic Whip Backhand and a New Technique. And just because we've discussed this new technique that I have discovered recently quite a bit here at the end, I don't want you to lose the overall picture and focus. And I hope you'll appreciate that I'm sharing with you, my latest insight, my latest experimentation with you, just to get you thinking about this whole issue of the backhand and the spacing problem. Whether you eventually end up using or adopting my technique doesn't really matter. It really matters whether you gravitate more to this kinetic whip backhand model that the best players in the modern era use. That's the important thing. So from the 50,000 foot level, what is the heck I'm talking about with this kinetic whip model? Now that came into being sort of around the year 2000 when this latest generation of players that are now retiring, Wawrinka, Federer, Djokovic, and all came into their ascendancy. And one of the reasons that they were ascendant is that they were using a new ground stroke technique, which I label the kinetic whip. So what is the kinetic whip? It's powering the swing with the power of the kinetic chain, the 32 body segments that all move in some manner or form in rotation, and they move in sequence up from the body, passing speed and power up the chain of the body till eventually gets to the hitting arm, out to the hand, and finally to the release of the racket in a whip-like manner. This is far different than the way tennis was played primarily in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and even into the 90s, where people more or less had a linear idea of swinging the racket to the target. One hand, two hands, it doesn't really matter. It was always to the target. And it was done with a pushing, levering action, driven and led primarily by the arm and shoulder. So the kinetic whip model is letting the body, the main muscles in our body, lead and drive and organize the stroke. And that there is a pulling action from the body transmitted passively into the arms and then released in a lightning quick release. And so in the previous generations of players, basically the racket head moved at the same speed as the hand and the arm, about 20 miles an hour maximum. In the new GOAT generation of the modern era, through the whip release, this racket head now is going 3 to 4 times faster than it was. And it's done not because we're promoting a to the target type of swing, but in fact a spiraling circular path. So I talked about this before. If the handle of your racket is the motorboat and the skier is here at the end of the tip, if I move this whole thing linearly towards the target at 20 miles an hour, my handle towards the target, the head is going 20 miles an hour, obviously, right? So the whip release basically is much more like a motorboat towing a skier, in which it starts out in one direction, but then as it reaches the turn of the swing, this handle is pivoted sharply up and around the curve. And this sends the racket head shooting out on the edge, just like a skier would going around a ski boat. This is the angular momentum that is so key and so different from past generations. And it gives us both speed and it gives us consistency, because when we do this correctly with the right form, this racket will come around and square up just at the right moment on its own. That's the basic idea of the kinetic whip model. And this kinetic whip model applies to all swinging sports in the modern era. In golf, again, driven by the body's power, the club head is released, but there is even a greater speed up factor because we're using a longer instrument in golf. So the speed up factor is sometimes 6 times as much as the hand speed. So the hand is going around the body at 20 miles an hour. Tour pros now swing the club head at 120 miles an hour because they have a longer, lighter instrument than we do in tennis and baseball. In baseball and in tennis, the speed up factor is more 3 to 4 times the hand speed. So where the hand goes around 20 miles an hour on the tennis swing, the racket head can go 80 miles an hour, maybe 90 miles an hour sometimes. Basically the same in baseball. It's a 3 to 4 times speed up factor to the barrel of the bat versus the hands going around the body because of this whip release. So this is a universal, component of high-level swinging. And I've said that the same principles that we learned in the kinetic whip forehand, how we execute that, apply just about equally to the backhand side. Now I won't go and list those all again and talk about them because we've gone over them, and we will go over them in more detail here. And I said that going right to the heart of the technique issue on the backhand side is this cramped position. If you're the target is out here to my right and I'm in a single-handed sort of take back normal, I have this cramped position to where I'm going to try to do something with this racket in terms of getting the width and space I need to get some sort of speed out of my swing, and then also be able to drop the racket head. And whether it's one hand or two hands, this spacing and width problem in the take back and transition to me is the most significant issue that we have to overcome, the boulder problem. But I want you to be realistic about after one lesson, you're not going to be able to solve the boulder problem in one lesson. And you have enough detail already on how you can start to experiment with my technique. That's fine. But in this final part of the how-to, I want to focus more on the release component, the whip release, because that's the end product of whatever technique that we are going to adopt. That's what we want to get to. So I want to focus more on the release element in this, let you experiment with my technique or any other technique that you see, and we'll get more into that in subsequent lessons. The first thing I want to discuss in terms of this release is how we grip the racket. Now, I said, and I showed you, that in the kinetic whip model, in the modern age, from the slot, the racket is releasing on edge, is thrown out on edge, and in contact it's on edge, somewhat close, and then in the follow through it's on edge. And finally comes around. Forehand, same thing. So it's this on-edge throwing component that I want you to focus on today. And in order to do that, I want you to do some changes probably to the way you grip your racket on the backhand side. So with the strings straight up and down vertical, the bevel of the racket, the top bevel here is bevel number 1. So I want you, whether you're a one-hander or two-hander, you're going to do all this one-handed. I want you to put the pad of your index finger basically on the top bevel. This is called an Eastern backhand grip that Federer and Haas and a lot of one-handers have used. Sometimes they have more of a closed face, but we'll get into that later. Right now, be sufficient that you change your grip structure so that the pad goes on bevel 1, and more importantly, you're gripping it in your fingers here, not around the palm, implanting that racket in the palm of your hand. We don't want that. That's going to inhibit the whip component of our technique. So while the index finger is going to give you a guide to put on bevel 1, after you do that, I basically want you to release your thumb and index finger from the grip and have you control the grip with these bottom 3 fingers. Now, you may think this is totally contradictory, but let me explain. So typically players use these 2 fingers. These are called the precision grip. This is what we use when we are writing an instrument or sewing, or if we were doing surgery, we would use these 2 index and thumb fingers. These are the precision grip fingers on any instrument. These bottom 3 fingers, even though we don't think of it, are the gripping fingers. These are the way we grip things strongly. So if we were lifting a barbell, for example, and we reach down, we'd be mostly lifting with these bottom 3 fingers. If we're hanging on a cliff or hanging on a bar, we'd be mostly gripping with these 3 fingers. Yes, these provide a little bit of support, but the strongest fingers are the bottom 3, contrary to common sense. So you can grip and control this racket just fine with these bottom 3 fingers. So again, to why are we doing this? Because with this type of grip, we're going to get the transmission of our twisting, torquing energy from our body transmitted through our hand and arm and into the hand release much more effectively for our kind of swing than if we are trying to control things with these 2 pincher fingers. This is why Ben Hogan said that these 2 fingers are the swing killers, because with these 2 fingers dominant in the release action, we are going to get this horizontal, more swinging gait action that players use, we were trying to get away from. This is not the throwing the racket out on edge release, where the strings basically are facing down through most of the process, only squaring up at the end enough to make good contact. So in these bottom 3 fingers, you know, loosely held at the bottom of the racket, yes, you can for now put these fingers around, but you're really controlling things with these bottom 3, and you have more flexibility in the coiling of this wrist and the release of this wrist, and all the power that you want with this type of grip. So now that you have a Eastern backhand grip in the fingers down here at the end, I can even take the last finger off and sort of wrap it around like that, but that's up to you. We'll talk about more of that later. But basically, I want you to begin a series of Frisbee-like backhand releases, because the Frisbee throw on the backhand side looks like an ideal backhand in the modern age. So in order to do that, so we have again, the Eastern backhand grip, but I want you to sort of orient this, and so at contact, that face is slightly closed. That's what we're looking for with this type of grip. But before we get there, I want you to think about moving this racket with the string bed facing on the ground like this. So unlike the on-edge kind of swinging gait process, I want the racket to be on edge, much like you were throwing a Frisbee on edge, right? You would never throw a Frisbee with this perpendicular orientation. It's a little easier to understand with a Frisbee, but we're going to get to this. It's the same idea, is that this is much more like a Frisbee throw with the racket strings facing down and then gradually coming up and through. And so we're going to be releasing in a Frisbee-like fashion. The other thing that I want you to do throughout all of these exercises is change the orientation towards the target. As I said many times, most recreational players stand stiff and square with their chest facing the opponent or the target. And some of the more advanced players, they'll turn a little and their lead shoulder will be facing the target, and the target being the camera. This is not the orientation that we want for a better backhand. Is in the ideal circumstance, we want to be able to orient ourselves 45, 60 degrees out this way. So now I want you to think about having your back to the target, not your entire back, but at least your right scapula, if you're right-handed, is facing the target as you're releasing this ball. And you can play around with different, how close that is, but think about, I'm trying to throw this Frisbee with my back to the target. So in this first exercise, we're not going to make it a big movement. We're just mostly going to focus on the hand and wrist and the racket. So we have our Eastern backhand grip in our fingers, right? And I just want you to do this kind of movement with strings facing down to the ground, and just feel the control of the racket in your fingers at the end of the racket, and letting your fingers sort of roll back and release forward like this, just like if I were just doing a Frisbee action like this. So a very small action, just focused on this movement. So I want you to do 5 medium swings, just like this, and then 5 faster ones, so feel a little bit more dynamic. So I'll pause the video for you to do those. So in this next sequence, I want to have you feel what it's like to take these swing killer fingers off the racket. So as you initially grip with your pad of your index finger on bevel 1, after you get that grip, I want you to take your thumb and index finger completely off. And now I want you to swing this just like you did before, 5 slow, 5 fast ones, pausing each time to kind of feel this and see that you can freely swing this and control it just with these bottom 3 fingers. I'll pause the video. In this third exercise, again, Eastern backhand grip. Again, your orientation is throwing your back to the target, at least your scap to the target. But this time I want you to take your racket back all the way with the strings facing the ground. So back here, it's over here, much like Nadal takes his backhand back, strings facing the ground back here. Just as if I were taking this Frisbee back here and throwing it. So I just want you to, you can put your fingers back on for now, and do 5 slow motion swings from back here, and then do 10 fast ones. Pausing in between to see how your technique is, see if we can improve it. We want a low to high throwing action at the end, particularly. As we move through contact, we want this racket Frisbee throw to be high up over our shoulder like this. So 10, 5 medium, 5 fast from that orientation. In this next exercise, I want you to focus on your athletic posture if you haven't been in it, which I'm kind of doubting maybe you were. So the athletic posture again is a hinging from the hips. So we're not bending over like this, we're hinging from the hips about 30 degrees forward. Our middle and lower back is level. You can have a slight hunch up here, but we want our middle and lower back to be neutral, even. And we want our knees flexed and our butt being engaged and our quads and our legs being engaged a little, so we're in a bouncing, athletic mode. So I want you to add that athletic posture into the full Frisbee action. 5 medium, 5 speed, but now we're lower in the ground. We're in a more athletic posture. We can recruit more of our rotational chain in this. So I just want you to go through medium to feel how much more power you have when you're connecting up with your kinetic chain. So I'll pause. In this next exercise, with the grip, the fingers, the throwing from the back orientation, from athletic posture, all those things, I want you to have more of a wind up with your shoulders. So going back, instead of starting maybe here, I want you to do a little bit of coiling back. And then trying to add more energy to that kinetic chain by that wind up, just as if you would a long Frisbee throwing action. They call it a pull when the Frisbee player is starting out an ultimate Frisbee game, because they're trying to throw that Frisbee the longest distance. They call it a pull, and we have that same pulling action of our body as we release the racket. So as we typically do in deliberate practice, we move from simple and slow to faster and more complex movements. And so we'll pretend now that we're out on a tennis court with your training partner, and I'm going to have you do 10 topspin backhands, Frisbee style, one-handed, with all the components of this new technique we've been talking about: the Eastern backhand grip, the grip in the fingers, the orientation of the back to the target, the athletic posture, and a little bit of a wind-up. And so I want your partner to stand on the other side of the net so that you can hit it cross court and not hit him or her. And I want the training partner to throw nice high bouncing balls so you don't really have to move. You're going to be concentrating on just the swinging action. And typically the player will toss the ball too low, so training partner has to practice nice high rhythmic tosses so you can get in the rhythm of hitting those. For this first exercise on court, I want you to be situated on the service line. So there'll be a premium of trying to hit topspin and a higher trajectory from this position than if you were standing at the back of the court, and the tossing of the ball is a lot easier to accomplish. So typically you will find as you use this Frisbee style one-handed technique is that the first shots will go to the bottom of the net because you're not typically using a racket face orientation that's as closed as this Eastern backhand grip, and your swing path is much more horizontal, and with a closed racket face that will send the ball, down into the net. That's fine. So after each one, you sort of make an adjustment and see if you can get a little bit higher, a little bit more topspin, a little bit more trajectory. And we're just swinging at medium 10, medium speed swings. We're just trying to feel this motion. Again, turning more to the backhand orientation and this free release, high free release, and just see how it feels. Don't worry about if it goes to the net or goes back. We're just seeing if we can strike the ball with topspin and get it somewhat over the net. And I'll pause the video. So as we typically do in deliberate practice, we move from simple and slow to faster and more complex movements. And so we'll pretend now that we're out on a tennis court with your training partner, and I'm going to have you do 10 topspin backhands, Frisbee style, one-handed, with all the components of this new technique we've been talking about. The Eastern backhand grip, the grip in the fingers, the orientation of the back to the target, the athletic posture, and a little bit of a wind-up. And so I want your partner to stand on the other side of the net so that you can hit it cross court and not hit him or her. And I want the training partner to throw nice high bouncing balls so you don't really have to move. You're going to be concentrating on just the swinging action. And typically the player will toss the ball too low, so the training partner has to practice nice high rhythmic tosses so you can get in the rhythm of hitting those. For the second series on court, I want you to stand back a few steps from the service line. Give yourself a little bit more room and basically repeat the exercises, but let's have 10 fast swings, again with the right orientation. And for the first 5, I want you to do that with your control fingers, the swing killers off the racket. So 10 fast without the pincher fingers on there, and then 5 at the end with your normal all 5 fingers in operation. The bottom fingers again will dominate the grip and control of the racket, not these 2 fingers, but I want you to feel both of those. So I'll pause the video for 10 fast topspin backhands, Frisbee style, a few feet behind the service line. In the final on-court drill, I want you to stand a few feet back further, midway between the service line and baseline, and I want to have you hit 10 of your fastest Frisbee backhand, topspin backhands that you can. Your training partner is going to have to throw the ball higher and have a higher bouncing ball, so you don't want to be hitting these really low. You want to hit it at your waist or a little bit higher, typically, ideally, in this drill. So you might have to work a little bit with your partner to get that tossing action right. So you're going to do everything and reflect on everything that you build up till now, all the technique, all the feels, and you're going to pause a little between each one, seeing, okay, how did that go? Did I go to the bottom of the net? Did I go back to the fence? What do I need to adjust? And try to make those adjustments. And I'll pause the video for 10 of those. Now, I'll be interested to see how that goes for you. When I was first doing this, I really felt that if I was just going to hit a driving low topspin backhand shot, this technique would pretty much do everything that I needed. I was able to generate tremendous speed and topspin using this technique. And I think in the future we may see players that do this. We'll see. What I did find is that there were certain limitations with getting a higher trajectory or sort of more topspin. So if you needed more net clearance, you were hitting a passing shot or whatever, more of a rally shot, then this kind of produced a too flat of a topspin trajectory. And therefore, there is definitely an element of looping back here using the non-hitting hand, either on the handle or the racket throat, that comes into play to give you a bigger back loop and higher release pattern. And we'll get into that. But for now, just think about how this slinging action, frisbee action with the strings facing down, felt for you and how effective it was. I hope that you'll sense the potential in that movement. So in wrapping up, reminding you that the overall theme of the model that we're talking about is the kinetic whip backhand. You've seen enough of my technique, my latest experimentation, for you to go out and try that for yourself, and I encourage you to do that. Play around with it in experimental mode. Don't get too caught up in whether you can do it so well at the beginning. I'd rather have it, you think of it as an exploration of this issue of cramping and take back, the space and width and control of the racket issue, the boulder problem. And I think this will just kind of give you some feeling for the issues that we're going to be talking about in more detail. But at the end of the day, it's not really about you adopting my technique. That doesn't really matter. It's about adopting a more kinetic whip model for your backhand that we'll be focused on. In the end here, I want to return to Alex Honnold's great achievement, the free solo climb of El Capitan, and encourage you to look at the clip, 1.5 minute clip I'll have in the notes about how we solved the boulder problem, or tried to solve it, and recommend that you go see the whole movie about it, which is called Free Solo. The last thing that I want to leave you with is something that was interesting about that story. It turns out, as Alex told the story to the filmmaker, is that he didn't share his goal with a lot of people or publicly. And so why didn't he do that? Well, he didn't really want the added pressure that comes with that kind of setting out that public goal, and all the worry and concern about falling and all the other things that would come into play. He didn't want that to distract his focus. And so he didn't share, except for a few close friends, and training partners. And that's the last thing that I'll leave you with today about this plan for improvement on your backhand or forehand serve, whatever, is I would say don't share. Don't share this publicly with your social and tennis group. As soon as you do that, you're putting added pressure and distraction on yourself. And typically, and I've seen this 1,000 times and experienced it 1,000 times, if you tell someone, oh, I'm going to build myself a Wawrinka backhand, well, your social tennis competitive players are not going to greet this with anything but scorn and mockery. Because what's going to happen as soon as you try to hit a backhand like Wawrinka and you hit the ball into the fence or over the fence, well, your tennis friends are going to say, what the heck? You're crazy. You're paying for lessons perhaps to become a worse player. You're making these horrible mistakes. And in the short term, you probably are making some horrible mistakes. And in the short term, you could say you're playing worse tennis. So that's going to be the perspective of people in general about your improvement plan. So I would say don't share, only with your training partner and your coach, what your goals are. Just tell people you're working on your game and leave it at that. So I would say that you should be more like Pete Sampras, who said, you know, I'm going to let my racket do my talking. And so when you run into this issue, don't share. Make a commitment to let your racket do the talking down the road, and we'll see who gets the last laugh.